"Mom!" Laurel didn't even know which of her children was screaming. She knew one thing and one thing only. Move towards the voice. That would be the only way to solve the problem, otherwise the voice would ring again. She followed the bellow, and it landed her in the bathroom of the girls' room. There her 7-year-old daughter, Aubrey, had her underwear in her hands, and she looked like she had just seen a ghost. "What?" Laurel had her hands akimbo, growling at the little girl. "Jenny gave my panties cooties." Aubrey's face morphed slowly from terror to blatant disgust with each word she uttered. That only annoyed Laurel more. "Aubrey, this isn't the time for silly games. Put on your underwear and let's get out of here. The bus wouldn't wait for you. And if it leaves you, I'll leave you as well." She put on her sternest face. She was usually soft with her girls, but not today. Today is not the time for sweethearts and honeys. She should have been out of the house by now. "Mom!" Normally, this would annoy Laurel, but she enjoyed it today. At least, their calling her would leave little unturned stones and little unexpected emergencies. With 5 children, she needed every one of them to call her at this point, if possible. She hurried to her 10-year-old son to fix whatever issues he had. Dylan needed extra looking after because he was particularly challenged with forgetting things. So much so that at some point, Laurel just theorized it was purposeful, especially as he wasn't academically or intellectually impaired in any way. Sorting Dylan out took a bit, but it was worth it. Now, she could focus solely on the youngest child, Jenny, while the remaining 2, Hunter and Chloe, who were 13 and 15 respectively, could be controlled with yells and barks. It was a task, but by 7:55 on the dot, they were all out of the house, the exact same time the school bus hit the brakes in front of the Hilton residence. "All right, guys, Chloe, you're in charge as usual. Check on Jenny during your break. Make sure she's had lunch. Hunter, you're still grounded. Come home once the bell rings, or Jenny would tell me." She patted her kids on the head as they filed into the bus, Chloe dodging her own pat with experience-oriented expertise. The naive ones bid her an elaborate goodbye with the wave and everything, and the bigger ones did the same thing, but with just their eyes. Familiar emotions are a hard thing for growing teens to express, she had heard. She wondered why it wasn't hard for her to do so when she was younger. Anyways, once the school bus left, it was her turn to wait for her own bus. She would usually take the bus to her workplace, a cafe where she would begin her first shift for the day. Today, however, was different. Her children had no idea, but for about a week now, she had been out of a job. The cafe couldn't take the amount of day off that she had to take to cater for her children, and they decided to let her off altogether. Today, she was going downtown to the precinct, to a certain skyscraper for an interview. Financial independence had been a problem since the heart-wrenching divorce that Jim had put her through, hence the jobs at different minimum wage positions. And those were all she got. Maybe if there was more time, she could pursue a job that tallied her finance degree and 7 years of experience before childbearing and nurturing became overwhelming. The bus finally pulled through and she hopped in, escaping the brunt of the chilly Chicago morning spring breeze. She had looked up the location of the office so much that she could probably hop off the bus and go there by foot. That's how anticipating she was of the outcome of the interview. It had to work. She had to get a job. She had with her just about $5 to last her till the last paycheck from the cafe she was working at. If this didn't work, she had absolutely no idea what to do. She tried not to think about it. Her nerves were a wreck, and she had to keep her eyes away from her hands to stop them from shaking. "I hope I'll be able to answer questions without fumbling," she muttered to herself in her head as she took her time to find a seat while the bus moved. She was being extra deliberate about these things today because they would matter. First impression, lasting impression. It would be unprofessional to give the excuse of a loose screw having torn her dress at the waistline, or that the next person spilled his morning coffee, and a few drops tinted her off-white in a rather unforgiving fashion. She found the perfect spot. Next to the aisle was an elderly man. He still dressed relatively smartly, almost like he was a working commuter himself, even though it would be a felony to have a man his age work an office shift. His calmness was the charm, and Laurel immediately took her place beside him. On seeing her come up to him, he smiled and nodded, before doing his best to tuck his legs for her to pass through and take the window seat. "Oh, why, you're so kind, sir," she thanked the man and took her seat beside him. Both of them shared a comfortable silence all the way from the suburbia to the heart of the city, with Laurel staring out of the window, taking the morning peace and rush cityscape, bleached by the fog. Laurel was deep in thought as the bus rumbled through the city. She barely noticed the stops passing by until the bus reached her own. Startled from her reverie, she stood and gathered her belongings. As she did, the old man sitting next to her also got up. It seemed they were getting off at the same stop. As Laurel moved toward the exit, she passed the ticket inspector standing by the door. She had just stepped off the bus when she noticed the inspector block the path of the old man. The inspector had a smirk on her face that didn't seem friendly at all. "What excuse do you have now?" the inspector asked, her tone mocking. "Still searching for that wallet?" Laurel paused a few steps away from the bus. She turned around to see the old man's face flush with embarrassment. I really have it," the old man stammered. "It's just in my other jacket. I swear." The ticket inspector laughed harshly. "Sure, and I'm the Queen of England. You're just trying to ride for free, aren't you, you bum?" Laurel's heart pounded with anger. She couldn't believe how cruel the inspector was being. She walked back towards the bus and faced the inspector. "Excuse me," Laurel said firmly, catching the attention of both the inspector and the old man. "Isn't it possible he's telling the truth? Maybe he really did forget his wallet." The inspector rolled her eyes. "And maybe I should start believing in fairy tales. I know these kinds." Laurel stood her ground. "That doesn't give you the right to insult him." The old man looked at Laurel with a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, young lady. I really did forget it today. It's not an excuse." "Yeah, whatever. I'm not going to let you old folk rob me out of my wage," the inspector growled at the man who was patting his pockets in slight panic. "I could have sworn I had it on me, ma'am. I promise you, it's not my intention to rob you or anything." "Then pay the damn fee," she snapped back. "Get your card out and tap. 2 easy steps, mister." A card was tapped into the system in less than 3 seconds, and it was not the old man's. "It's $1.75. You don't have to be such a wench," Laurel hissed, and guided the man down from the bus. "Ha! Good riddance," the inspector driver cackled, and in an instant the bus was gone. "Oh my, thank you," the old man tried to bow. No, it's only human." Laurel stretched a hand to stop the man from bowing. "I must go now. Have a great day." She cued him for his name. "William," he smiled broadly. "William Burns." "Laurel Stewart." She stretched her hand for his comfort. "I'll never forget this, Laurel. Let me make it up to you. I promise I'm not some old swine that goes around relying on the spontaneous goodwill of others. I would no, that's too small. Maybe run through groceries for the week." Laurel shook her head. "For $1.75? That's not a fair trade now, is it?" She smiled. "Besides," her head panned to the building she should be in by now, "I have to hurry and get somewhere. We'd cross paths again, sir. Maybe you'll pay my own fare in return," she joked lightly. "Well, let me have your number then. I'll call you when I get home. Just to extend my well wishes." The pair exchanged numbers and she bade him goodbye before facing the massive building in front of her. Interview time. Laurel didn't hesitate to walk into the building as smartly and as quickly as possible, even though her nerves were a total wreck. Each step she took felt like a million years between raising her foot off the floor and bringing it back down. Nevertheless, she persevered. She knew that she wasn't going to be applying for the best of jobs, but to her, this felt like a starting point. If she could familiarize herself with the environment, she could integrate well and progress well. Her children were getting old enough. Already, Chloe could manage all the children by herself for at least an overnight. That would be enough time between when she left the house and when she got back. The possibilities were endless at this point. She could work extra hard and network as well. She waited in the reception, checking herself over and again to make sure she was well presented. An off-white knee-length smart dress, hugging her physique, but not too tightly, and a pair of charcoal flats seemed fitting. She was applying for a lowly position, but it didn't matter. "Mrs. Hilton, you're up next." The soft receptionist's voice spun her world a little with that statement. Now was the time. She nodded gratefully, giving her most confident smile before going in through the door that was directed to her. What she saw would have made her pass out if she was a tad bit weaker that morning. Her heart wouldn't have been able to take it. She recognized him right away. He sat on the left side of the interview panel, which seemed to be an elaborate interviewing panel of 3 people for a lowly job, like a janitor. Still, she maintained her composure. Everything chaotic went on in her head. Nothing on her face gave her shock away. Or at least, she told herself so. "Oh, don't be intimidated, darling," the older man in the middle, maybe in his 60s, offered a warm smile as she entered cautiously. "We were interviewing for some high-level positions as well. That's the reason we look like this. We're just going to ask a few questions. It's for security reasons." The lady to his right chuckled sweetly. They seemed at peace with Laurel, except Jim, of course, whose gaze burned holes into Laurel's perplexed face. "Oh, thanks. I'm sorry, she stuttered. She cursed inwardly at herself because she told herself that she was going to maintain her composure. On the other side of the panel, Jim Carson grit his teeth and bit his lips to keep the gasp of shock from spilling out. What was she doing here? He thought to himself. Did she know he was here? Has she come to pressure him for more child support? Jim and Laurel were married for 16 years, right from when Jim was 23 and Laurel was 21. Both of them had similar career paths, and he met her as an intern in a company where he was staffed on probation, and both of them fell hopelessly in love. The happier the relationship, the sadder the end. Isn't that how it's said? Everything was bliss until Laurel had to quit her own side of the job after the birth of her third child. Money became scarce, and Laurel lost her shape. In his eyes, she was no longer the beautiful, hard-working, intelligent woman he used to know. Her stomach folded, and her breasts sagged. She gained a few pounds and also a few words in her mouth, especially when he went to the casino. That's when Jim had enough. He met Marissa, a more youthful version of Laurel, and decided that he was no longer going to wait for death to do them apart, as he had sworn on his wedding day. Not even the cries of little Jenny could make him stay. Their intimate life was great, and the life he led with her was exciting, child-free, and intoxicating. It kept him in a perpetual high, too drunk with the pleasure to open his ears to the cry of his children and wife. And now, here was his ex-wife, applying for a job he knew was an insult to her career experience. Still, his face contorted into an unsatisfied scowl as he passed her application documents, noting she left out everything relating to her academic qualifications. By the time the interview was over, Jim felt like he was the one being interrogated and had to wipe the beads of sweat that streamed across his brow. What if everyone found out she was his ex-wife? What an embarrassment that would be. He knew there and then that Laurel couldn't work here. Not for long, at least. Behind her back, of course, Jim got to work. He would have found it easier to just ignore his ex-wife and keep to his duties too as the manager. But today, Jim wanted to take his position a little too seriously. He wanted to see just how much influence his position had on the company, and if it even meant anything at all. Before the closing of the day, he was found in the office of Trevor Russo. "Sir, well, I was going through the usual background checks for this new janitor we were considering for hire and..." 5 children? Whew, that's an awful lot if you ask me. He stirred the direction in his angle, trying to draw his boss's perspective. Trevor looked up from his phone and thought about it for a while, barely even remembering the person. As soon as his mind flashed back to the pretty woman from earlier, a warm smile swept his face. He remembered her being so jittery, almost kind of reminding him about his own humble beginnings, none of which any of his staff knew about. "Oh yeah, that woman has 5 children? Well, that's a handful," he nodded. "Yes," Jim began his instigation. "And you know what I was just thinking? A lot of children is going to mean a lot of breaks. More children to get sick at any given point. She's a mother. You think she's not going to want to take it?" "Oh, she will, all right, that's inevitable," Trevor chuckled, indifferent to the matter, but Jim felt concerned. More than Trevor saw was necessary. "What's the matter?" Jim shrugged, trying to feign nonchalance. "I'm just looking out for the company, sir. What would happen if she takes one too many breaks and she can't function properly?" At that point, Trevor himself burst into deep laughter, one that perplexed Jim. "My God, sometimes you take your job a little too seriously. Maybe that's why I like you," Trevor commended him. It would have meant a lot to him on a different occasion, but now was not the time to get butterfly-bellied over compliments. "I was just looking out for the interests of the company, sir." On what? Cleaning? If she took 3 consecutive days off and everyone in the building was civilized, you wouldn't even notice she was gone. Jim huffed and struggled to contain his disappointment. He feared if he disagreed too much, the boss would catch on that he had something to hide, and he loathed the mess that would come with revealing that he had an ex-wife whom he abandoned, and children he practically became estranged to. He was going to have to get her out of there as soon as possible. That was the next plan. Laurel was cleared to start work the very next day. Jim had always sought to make life difficult for her, ever since the day he deemed her unworthy of his admiration. The fluorescent lights of the corporate office flickered as Laurel pushed her cleaning cart down the gleaming corridor. It was her first day, and the air was thick with the scent of industrial cleaner and her own quiet determination. Jim was already in his office when he heard whispers that Laurel had been hired as the new janitor after all. His heart sank. The walls of his carefully constructed world seemed to tremble. As Laurel rounded the corner, her cart squeaking slightly, Jim stepped out from his office. His face was a mask of contained fury, his suit crisp, his tie knotted perfectly. An armor against his rising panic. "Laurel," he hissed, stepping close enough to loom over her. "Of all the companies in this city, you choose to work at mine. Are you doing this on purpose?" Laurel stopped, her hands steady on the handle of her cart. She looked up at Jim, her eyes clear and unflinching. "I didn't even know you worked here, Jim. I'm just trying to support my kids." "You better leave before it's too late." Jim's voice was low and threatening, a sharp contrast to the sterile cheer of the office around them. "You're trying to ruin my career with your presence. Everyone here thinks I'm impeccable. They can't know about us." Years ago, Laurel might have recoiled, might have walked away without a word. But life had tempered her. Hardships had sculpted her into someone new, someone who could not be so easily dismissed. "Jim," she said calmly, her voice barely a whisper yet carrying a firm edge, "I won't tell anyone about what happened if that's what you're worried about." but I'm not the old Laurel anymore. I can't be ordered away just because you're uncomfortable." Jim's eyes narrowed, his plans crumbling in the face of her quiet defiance. He took a step back, his mind racing for another angle, another way to control the narrative that had always been his to dictate. Laurel turned away, pushing her cart down the hall. Her back was straight, her resolve clear. She had children to feed, dreams to nurture, and no time for the ghosts of the past that tried to haunt her in the guise of a bitter ex-husband. Behind her, Jim watched, his anger a simmering storm that had no outlet. He knew then that Laurel wouldn't be intimidated into leaving. Not this time. As she disappeared around the corner, the hum of the office seemed to swallow his frustration, rendering it insignificant in the broader sweep of the day. Jim was surprised by Laurel's response. He hadn't anticipated that she would react in such a way. Frustrated that he could no longer manipulate her, he resolved to try a different approach. "You missed a spot. Are you usually this inconsistent?" Jim's voice dripped with irritation as he pointed to a missed spot on the floor. Laurel bit back a sharp retort that formed in her mind. You would know about inconsistency, knowing well that voicing such thoughts could jeopardize her job. "Are you making a face at me?" Jim scowled, noticing her expression. "I'm sorry, Jim," Laurel quickly apologized. "Jim?" He raised an eyebrow. She met his gaze, the weight of her realization pressing down on her. She had always known Jim was difficult, but now she was seeing a harsher side of him. With a heavy heart, she corrected herself. "I meant to say sir." Holding back tears was a struggle, especially since the day had barely begun. If the morning of her first day was this challenging, how would she manage the days or weeks to follow? "That's what I thought," Jim grunted, shuffling his feet on the ground, scraping off dirt from his shoes. It was clear Jim enjoyed making her uncomfortable, and he was succeeding. Throughout her 10-hour shift on that first day, she escaped to the bathroom 3 times, not to use it for its intended purpose, but to sob quietly, each time emerging with puffier eyes and a redder face. But she was determined not to let Jim defeat her so easily. A month passed and Laurel was seriously reconsidering Jim's behavior. He seemed to put significant effort into making her miserable, and despite her attempts to ask him why, he never gave her a satisfactory answer. Despite her deep disdain for him, Laurel was determined to cope. Every day she walked through the company doors and offered him a smile, pretending he wasn't the cause of her intense, suffocating sadness. Yet for Jim, any kind of friendly exchange was out of the question. "Pick up the trash, Hilton. You've been sitting for too long," he snapped as he strode past the corner where Laurel had paused to rest her weary head after a hectic morning. "I've already done that, sir, just a little while ago," she replied quickly, without even looking up. She was accustomed to his demeanour by now. It had been a month of constant nitpicking. What hadn't he criticised? Keeping her eyes closed, she waited for the familiar clanking of his shoes on the marble floor to fade away, but it didn't. Curious, she cracked open one eye and caught him glaring at her with icy hostility. Her heart raced and her body tensed. She quickly stood up, scanning the area to ensure she hadn't missed any tasks. Her gaze landed on the trash basket in the hallway. It was nearly empty, containing only a few crumpled papers and a squashed Dr. Pepper can. What more did he want? Jim's expression remained fierce and unfathomable. Rather than confront him, Laurel decided it was best to avoid further conflict. She slipped away to the bustling main reception, blending in with the midday crowd. Here, amidst the influx of customers, Jim was preoccupied with ensuring that everyone was greeted with a smile, leaving him no time to torment her. As Laurel mingled with the visitors, her thoughts drifted to Dylan, her sick 10-year-old at home. The job was important to her, but her self-respect was paramount. Under Jim's harsh treatment, she felt less and less human each day. I left the hallway after you told me to leave. What do you want? Laurel asked. I told you to leave and pick trash. His voice began picking traction again. Not come here and become a nuisance, Jim said. All the bins are empty, Jim, she replied, not as intense as he came for her, but strong enough to make her voice heard. It shook because she was a little terrified, and she had the adrenaline of an impending exchange coursing through her veins. But it didn't matter now. Jim went over to one of the trash cans. Of course, there were little bits of trash in them. He picked it up and dumped all the contents on the floor. You said this was empty. I'm not picking that up, Laurel growled. That was the height of disrespect, and she wasn't going to have it. Well, you either do and the rest of the trash in this building, or you tender your resignation. It's up to you, he snarled. She was at a crossroads, one that would determine the fate of her life for a short or maybe long period. But long before this moment, the minute he started talking and yelling, she had already made her decision. She propped the broom up and hurled it at him with all the spite in her boiling blood, with tears streaming down her face. It was a shit show working with you, sir. I'll be waiting for this month's paycheck, she choked, and consequently stormed out of the building. She was done for, and she knew it. She knew she should have taken the insult and swallowed Jim's taunts for the sake of her children, but she failed. Jim won, and she was now, once again, jobless. As she trekked to God knows where, the tears trekked with her, never once stopping its stream down her face. It was tears of hopelessness. She looked far ahead of her, the city's lagoon. She could walk all the way to the pier and hurl herself over. The death would be painful, but quick enough from what she had heard. The only thing that stopped her from doing it was the thought of her children. How on earth would they survive without her? Dylan was still ill, and Jenny was still a 5-year-old little angel. Aubrey would cry for days till she fell sick. No, the escape wouldn't be worth it for her kids. As she bent over the pier watching the water churn in endless, blissful waves, regretting her resolve to stay in this cruel world and persevere, her phone rang. She expected the call from the office she just ran out from. It would make sense. Her stuff was still there, as she left in a fit of rage. They'd either plead with her to complete the day's shift, which she wasn't going to, or come to take her things. It was Thomas, one of her supervisors at work. His voice was sharp as he demanded, "Where the heck did you run off to?" Laurel, already in tears, struggled to keep her composure. Fighting the urge to sob, she explained, "I had to step outside for some fresh air. Something irritated my lungs." She was planning to leave the job soon, but she feared that Jim might seek revenge if he knew the real reason behind her departure. So she decided to keep the details to herself. "I'll just tell them I can't handle the janitor's job anymore," she thought. Upon returning to the office, Laurel realized that the urgency to find her wasn't due to her leaving her belongings in the hallway. Instead, someone had urgently requested to see her. Her heart raced as panic set in. Could it be something to do with my children? She worried. Rushing to change out of her work clothes, Laurel was about to head out when suddenly a man appeared from around the corner. She looked up, surprised, and saw an elderly man in a neat suit, his face marked by lines of age and eyes filled with urgency. "Thank goodness I've found you. I was worried I might lose you again," the old man exclaimed, his voice a mix of relief and excitement. Laurel, confused and slightly wary, took a step back. "I'm sorry, sir, but I think you've mistaken me for someone else." No, it's me, William," the man insisted, his eyes searching hers for recognition. "Remember? You paid for my bus fare a few weeks ago?" As he mentioned the bus, Laurel's memory clicked. The encounter flashed before her eyes. "Oh yes, I remember you now. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you at first," she said with a smile, feeling a bit embarrassed. William's face lit up. I'm so glad. I've been trying to find you ever since that day, but I lost your phone number almost as soon as you gave it to me. Laurel's eyebrows rose in surprise. You've been looking for me all this time? Yes, William nodded. He then explained how he had been at the office earlier, talking with one of the reception clerks, when he saw her storm out. I was sure it was you, but by the time I got up, you had already left the building. I asked around, but nobody seemed to know who you were. When I described you, they just shrugged. His tone turned more serious as he continued. I even asked to see the security camera footage. When I pointed you out, the manager, Thomas, dismissed it, saying you were just a janitor and nobody special. But to me, that didn't matter. I knew I needed to find you. Laurel felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Annoyance at the dismissive way Thomas had referred to her, warmth from William's earnest efforts, and curiosity about why he was so determined to reconnect. William's gaze was steady on her. Here we are. You helped me once when I needed it, and I just wanted to thank you properly, he said with a smile. Laurel was taken aback by the kindness in William's voice. After enduring a day filled with harsh words from Jim, this unexpected warmth felt like sunshine breaking through the heavy rain. Her heart lightened, and a tentative smile crossed her face as she listened to him speak. It was a small, comforting moment in the midst of her turbulent day. William, all I did was pay for your bus ticket. It's really not that big of a deal, she tried to tell him, but he shook his head as vehemently as a man his age can. You didn't just pay for my bus ticket, darling. You saved this old man from the thing he perhaps fears the most, embarrassment. I ought to do you one back, he insisted. Laurel chuckled and asked, what would be the embarrassment? William let out a giggle, reminiscent of a little boy, and leaned in closer to ensure no one else could overhear. Laurel glanced around, slightly anxious, wondering if he might share something serious. But what William revealed next caught her off guard, prompting a loud laugh. I was running late for a date, he confessed, and if you hadn't covered my bus fare, I would have been embarrassed in front of everyone on the bus, especially in front of the lady waiting for me at the bus stop. Determined, he added, so there's no way I can just accept a no for an answer. I have to pay you back somehow. He then suggested, how about we move to a cafe nearby? At this point, Laurel felt too overwhelmed to refuse. Her day had been trying, and the idea of a friendly chat over coffee was too good to pass up. Sure, she replied. That sounds like a nice change of pace. As they started walking toward a nearby coffee shop to chat further, Laurel felt a lightness she hadn't felt in weeks. Here was someone who valued her, not for her job or what she could do for him, but simply because of a small kindness she had shown. It was a stark contrast to her daily struggles and the perfect end to a bad day. Laurel and William settled into a cozy corner of the bustling cafe, each nursing a steaming cup of coffee. The noise around them seemed to fade as they delved into conversation. I really didn't expect to see you working as a janitor, William confessed, his tone filled with genuine surprise. Laurel chuckled lightly. Well, I wish I could say I was one of the brokers at Livery & Company. It's been a dream of mine. She sighed, a hint of wistfulness in her voice. But I had to start somewhere. Not many companies are eager to hire someone with so many kids, even though I have all the necessary certificates, even a financial analyst license that I've never gotten to use. As the cafe began to hum with the late afternoon rush, Laurel and William continued their conversation, the warmth of their coffee cups matched by the warmth in their exchange. When you mentioned your children, you lit up, William observed with a smile, prompting Laurel to share more about her family. Laurel's face brightened further at the mention of her children. Oh, my kids are my little hurricanes, she said with a laugh that filled the space around them with joy. No matter what the day brings, the thought of returning home to their open arms, ready to leap up and hug me. Always keeps me going." William sat back, his smile a quiet beam as he listened to Laurel speak with such affection and energy about her life at home. He did not interrupt, choosing instead to appreciate the depth of her love for her family. Curious about his own reasons for being at Livery and Company, Laurel asked, "So what brings you there today?" William hesitated, his reply coming out a bit uncertain. "Oh, I was there on someone's request," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. It wasn't the truth, but he chose not to divulge his actual purpose. Time seemed to accelerate as they shared stories and insights, the cafe's ambient noise a distant backdrop to their engaging discussion. Before they knew it, the sky outside had darkened to a deep twilight. "It's been such a lovely evening," Laurel said as they gathered their belongings, her voice tinged with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for the coffee and for such heartfelt conversation. It really helped me forget the troubles of today." William stood up, his expression sincere. "It was the least I could do," he replied. "You deserve a bit of kindness." As they stepped outside, William mentioned he wouldn't be taking the bus back. "I think I'll just take a walk," he said, which was also a lie. Laurel, checking her watch, realized it was time to hurry. "I better catch my bus," she said, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "Have a good one, William." Laurel beamed and walked off. William waved to her and remained there with a bitter smile on his face. As the evening wound down and Laurel disappeared into the bustling city crowd, William was left sitting on the curb, lost in his thoughts. The quiet of the night was broken only by the soft hum of a car pulling up beside him. A sleek black sedan that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The door opened, and out stepped Matt, William's driver and bodyguard, with a slight grin on his face. "She's not bad, sir," he commented casually, eyeing William for a reaction. William shot him a stern look, his voice tinged with irritation. "Not funny, Matt." Despite his boss's disapproval, Matt chuckled a bit more before regaining his composure. Once home, William settled into the vast quiet of his living room, the soft cushions of the sofa enveloping him. The room was large and immaculately decorated, yet it felt overwhelmingly empty. He closed his eyes, replaying the conversations of the evening in his mind, focusing on Laurel's laughter and the warmth of her stories about her children. A smile briefly crossed his face as he remembered her joy and energy. However, sleep eluded him that night. He lay in his bed, eyes wide open, the silence of the room amplifying his solitude. Eventually, he moved to his study, where he opened his laptop and stared at the charts without really seeing them. It was only in the early hours of the morning that exhaustion took over, and he managed to snatch a few hours of rest. Upon waking, driven by a mixture of impulse and need, William reached out to Laurel. Hearing her voice full of surprise and concern, he quickly fabricated a reason for his call. "I need to ask for a favor," he lied. "I'd like to come by your place if that's all right." "Of course, you're more than welcome," Laurel responded with her characteristic generosity. After hanging up, William felt a pang of guilt for his deceit. He didn't need a favor. He was simply lonely. The vivid description Laurel had given of her life, filled with the simple joy of her children's laughter and love, had struck a chord within him. He looked around at his luxurious surroundings, the stark emptiness a stark contrast to the lively, loving home Laurel described. William Burns, a man who owned nearly half of Livery and Company, was a figure of wealth and influence, yet beneath the veneer of success, he was profoundly alone. His life had been a pursuit of wealth and power, but at 60, he found himself without the family he had always desired. The realization of his deep loneliness and the longing for a simple, happy family life had been exacerbated by Laurel's stories. Those who didn't know him well saw him as arrogant, They thought he viewed having a family as a barrier to his career and financial goals. But this wasn't true for William. He had always dreamed of having a family and children. When he first made his money, many beautiful women came into his life. William, unfortunately, broke many hearts, thinking little of these relationships. He never deeply connected with any of them, as it was always easy for him to move on to someone new and seemingly more exciting. By his 40s, he realized he needed to change and settle down. Karma seemed to catch up with William when he met Isabel, a woman 10 years his junior. William fell deeply in love with her. He treated Isabel like royalty, lavishing her with gifts that others could only envy. He had never been so in love. It felt like he was losing his mind over her. His happiness grew as his dream of settling down and starting a family began to materialize. William proposed, and they soon married. The first year of their marriage was blissful. Isabel suggested they enjoy a few years together before starting a family, a common choice among couples, and William found nothing odd about her request. However, a year and a half into their marriage, Isabel began to travel frequently for her job as a fashion designer, which required her to be away often. At first, William travelled with her, but she later asked to travel alone to focus better on her work and return sooner. William trusted her explanation, although her mysterious absences made him fall even deeper in love. Her weeks-long trips left William feeling lonely and longing for her presence. When Isabel became pregnant, William's joy knew no bounds. He felt like the happiest man alive, married to the most beautiful woman, and soon to be a father. His dream was finally becoming a reality. Ronnie, their little baby boy, was born, and life seemed perfect until one unexpected turn. William had been scheduled for a 3-day business trip, but managed to resolve everything by phone, eager to return to his family whom he couldn't bear to leave. Upon returning home early with a surprise, he was met with one himself. Another man was cradling his baby. The shocking truth unravelled quickly. Isabel was a professional con artist, and the man holding the baby was her actual husband. Even more devastating, Ronnie wasn't William's son. This revelation shattered William. He regretted coming back early, wishing he had remained blissfully unaware of the betrayal. The sweet life he thought he had was a lie. Isabel and little Ronnie, though right before him, were not truly his family. Stricken with grief and unable to cope, William withdrew from social life. He didn't turn to alcohol or other escapes. Instead, he lost all trust in relationships. Over time, William began to heal, albeit slowly, choosing to immerse himself entirely in work to avoid further heartbreak. For 20 years, he lived in solitude. Now, years later, William found himself standing in front of Laurel's door. He wasn't there with romantic intentions. He simply wanted to remember what it felt like to be part of a family, even if just for a moment. William stood outside Laurel's modest house, surrounded by an assortment of grocery bags and boxes filled with toys. Matt, his driver, had just finished unloading everything and drove off. As Laurel opened the door, her eyes widened at the sight. Seeing her surprise, William quickly explained, "I grabbed these on the way. I actually forgot to properly thank you the other day." Laurel chuckled, a bit puzzled. "Didn't you already buy me a coffee?" "That was just a small gesture," William replied with a smile. "I wanted to thank you properly." Her laughter faded into a look of curiosity. William's actions were unlike anything she had experienced before, and she found his generosity both heartwarming and mysterious. "I've never done anything quite like this either," William confessed, his smile gentle. At that moment, Laurel's children gathered curiously around her, peeking at the visitor and the unexpected gifts. "Is he a delivery man? Are those boxes for us?" They chimed in eagerly. "Knock it off and be nice," Laurel chided gently, then turned to William. "They're just excited." William laughed heartily. I guess I could be a delivery man today, why not? He played along, enjoying their innocent speculation. Laurel introduced William to her children and invited him inside. The moment he stepped through the door, the kids swarmed around him, tugging at his clothes and asking dozens of questions. They treated him as if he had been a family friend forever, their easy acceptance surprising him. In the kitchen, Laurel began unpacking the groceries and noticed that many items were more luxurious than what they were used to. She peeked into the living room from time to time, watching William engage enthusiastically with her children, explaining things and answering their endless questions. Eventually, Laurel prepared a meal with the groceries William had brought. The aromas filled the house, and when it was time to eat, the children's faces lit up at the sight of the food, dishes they had never tasted before. They all gathered at the dining table, enjoying the delicious dinner. "This is really good," William remarked, his tone reflecting genuine pleasure. He couldn't remember the last time he had enjoyed a meal like this. Throughout dinner, Laurel remained somewhat quiet, occasionally glancing at William and offering a polite smile to make him feel welcome. After the meal, as the children resumed their playing, Laurel began clearing the table. With a moment's pause, she turned to William, her expression serious. "All of this is just too much for a thank you," she said softly. "The groceries you brought are quite expensive, things I would never normally buy." Then, looking him directly in the eye, she asked, "How could a man who couldn't pay for a bus ticket afford all of this?" Her tone was gentle, yet filled with a genuine need for an answer, reflecting the disparity between the William she met and the generosity he had shown. William chuckled ruefully as he began to share more of his story with Laurel. "That day on the bus, I didn't actually need to take it. I just wanted to see and interact with normal people," he confessed. He explained that he was running late for a date with a woman he had met online. "I did make it, but unfortunately it didn't work out. She said I wasn't her type," William added, a hint of amusement in his voice. Laurel chuckled in response, but her face still held traces of curiosity. Sensing her lingering questions, William decided to open up further about his life. "When we met at Livery and Company, I wasn't there at someone's request like I told you. The truth is, I own half of its stocks," he revealed, his voice steady but hesitant, unsure how she would react. Laurel shook her head in amazement, her initial surprise quickly shifting to a look of empathy. "I'm really sorry to hear you had to lose your family," she said softly, her words filled with genuine sympathy. "You're always welcome to come over here whenever you want." William looked up, surprised and moved by her response. In his experience, revealing his wealth usually changed how people saw him. They often viewed him as a means to an end, a stepping stone to their own financial goals. But Laurel's reaction was different. She showed no interest in his fortune, only in his well-being. As Laurel stood to clear the remaining dishes, she glanced at her children, her expression one of deep gratitude. Then, turning back to William, she shared her thoughts. "I can't imagine living completely alone," she said earnestly. "Having my kids around makes all the difference." Watching her move around the kitchen, William found himself puzzled by her independence and integrity. After a moment's hesitation, he voiced the question that had been on his mind. "Why haven't you asked if you could work for me? You have all the necessary credentials," he inquired, genuinely curious. Laurel chuckled softly as she washed the dishes. "As far as I know, major stockholders like you don't usually get involved in hiring at the lower levels. Besides, it would feel like cheating if I asked for such a favor. I'd rather work hard and earn my position on my own," she explained, her voice firm and confident. William was taken aback by her response. Her determination to succeed through her own efforts rather than leveraging his position struck him deeply. It was a stark contrast to many of the interactions he had had throughout his life. Laurel's integrity and resilience impressed him, And in that moment, he felt a profound respect for her. A respect that went beyond financial transactions and spoke to the core values that he found increasingly rare in his world of wealth and power. Laurel paused in the midst of her activities, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. She wiped her hands on her apron, then turned to William with a small, knowing smile. "You know, there is a favour you could actually do for me," she said, her tone slightly hesitant but hopeful. The next morning found William at the offices of Livery and Company, ready to fulfill Laurel's request. He approached the reception desk with a purposeful stride. "Could you please direct me to Jim Carson's office?" Upon entering, William was met with an enthusiastic reception. Jim sprang to his feet, his grin wide and overly welcoming. "Mr. Burns, what an honour to have you here," he exclaimed, the respect in his voice tinged with an unmistakable note of awe. He hastily offered William a chair and summoned his secretary with a quick wave. "Can I get you anything to drink, Mr. Burns?" Jim asked, eager to please. William settled into the chair, his gaze steady and observant. He watched Jim carefully, noting the eagerness in the younger man's demeanour. "How's work going, Jim?" he inquired casually. The question seemed to ignite even more excitement in Jim, who mistakenly assumed William's visit was a personal commendation of his efforts. Jim launched into a detailed account of recent successful deals and projects, trying to impress his visitor with every word. William listened quietly, nodding at appropriate intervals. As he observed Jim's animated explanations, he reflected on the contrast between them. Here was a man who had chosen to prioritize money and success, perhaps at the expense of other, deeper values. It was a path William knew all too well, yet seeing it in someone else brought a new clarity to his thoughts about wealth and personal fulfillment. Jim continued, oblivious to William's introspective mood. William's expression shifted visibly as he listened to Jim's enthusiastic rundown of business successes. His face grew increasingly stern, reflecting his growing disinterest and irritation. Amid Jim's animated speech, William suddenly raised his hand, signalling for silence. "Listen to me," William interjected sharply, cutting through the noise. "I've spent my entire life working, chasing things I thought I wanted. But you," he paused, his gaze hardening, "you've discarded something I've come to realize is invaluable. Family." Jim blinked, taken aback by the sudden change in topic. "Excuse me," he stammered, confusion clouding his features as he tried to grasp the direction of the conversation. William's irritation mounted as he noted Jim's polite, yet obviously self-serving demeanour. It disgusted him to see how eagerly Jim tried to curry favour, seemingly prepared to do anything to secure a favourable opinion from someone of William's influence. Unable to contain his frustration any longer, William leaned forward, his voice dropping to a firm, authoritative tone. "I'm here because of Laurel," he stated bluntly, fixing Jim with a steely gaze. "I'm not going to have you fired, but under one condition." Jim's eyes widened, a flicker of fear passing through them as he listened intently. "You can have whatever personal life you choose, with whomever you wish," William continued, his voice stern. "But you have children who need you. They have needs that must be met." His tone left no room for negotiation, emphasizing his demand for responsibility. William stood abruptly, his chair scraping back against the floor. "I'm not asking you to get back with Laurel. I'm telling you to ensure your children are provided for." With those final words, he turned on his heel and left Jim's office, leaving a stunned and silent Jim to process the unexpected ultimatum. William strode towards Laurel's house, his steps light with anticipation. The thought of spending time with her kids, whom he had come to adore, filled him with a genuine joy he hadn't felt in years. From that day on, he became a regular visitor, forming a bond with each visit that only seemed to grow stronger. Despite his frequent offers, Laurel firmly refused any financial assistance or corporate influence to secure a job. William deeply respected her for her integrity and determination to stand on her own 2 feet. However, he couldn't help but feel frustrated as she continued to face rejections from higher-level positions and had to settle for another janitor's job. As William watched Laurel struggle, an idea sparked in his mind. He had plenty of work that needed attention: paperwork, financial charts, and other tasks. Maybe, just maybe, Laurel could help him with these for a fair wage. After some persuasion, highlighting it as a temporary arrangement, Laurel reluctantly agreed to take on the work. William was relieved and set the pay at what he believed was a fair rate for the job, despite wishing he could offer more. The children quickly grew attached to William, treating him like a family member. During one lively dinner, the youngest, Aubrey, piped up with the innocence of a child. "Can William be our grandpa?" The question, asked so earnestly, brought a warm smile to everyone's faces. Laurel, amused and touched, replied, "Well, why don't you ask him yourself?" Turning to William with bright eyes, Aubrey repeated, "Can you be our grandpa?" William chuckled, his eyes twinkling with affection. "Well, I thought I was already," he responded, his voice filled with warmth. This simple exchange cemented William's new role within the family. His life began to revolve around his visits to Laurel's home, a stark contrast to his previous, lonelier routine. He found himself eager to finish work each day, looking forward to the laughter and warmth that awaited him at Laurel's house. One sunny afternoon, Laurel's voice carried a hint of urgency over the phone. "William, can you come home a bit earlier today? I need your help with something," she requested. Curious but always willing to assist, William agreed without hesitation and rearranged his schedule to arrive at Laurel's house promptly. Upon his arrival, he was surprised to find Laurel's elderly neighbour, Sarah, at the house. Laurel greeted William warmly, but was mysteriously brief about the reason for his early arrival. "Could you and Sarah wait here in the living room? I need to sort a few things out," she said, before shepherding the children outside to play. As William and Sarah found themselves alone, an initial awkward silence slowly gave way to polite small talk, which soon blossomed into a deep and engaging conversation. They discovered shared interests and viewpoints, and the hours slipped by unnoticed. The afternoon turned into evening, and yet there was no sign of Laurel or the children returning. It became clear that Laurel had perhaps orchestrated this meeting between the two under the guise of needing help. With a smile at the clever setup, William decided not to question Laurel's intentions, appreciating her subtle matchmaking. As night fell, it was time for Sarah to head home. William, ever the gentleman, offered to walk her back to her house. The short walk was filled with comfortable chatter, a continuation of their earlier conversation. In the days that followed, William and Sarah found themselves seeking each other's company more frequently. Their meetings were filled with laughter and shared stories, and a warm friendship quickly deepened into something more meaningful. It was a typical morning in their favourite cafe, with the hustle and bustle of the city just outside the window. Laurel was busy outlining the schedule for William's upcoming meetings, her pen moving swiftly across her notepad. As she spoke about each appointment with meticulous care, William watched her, his mind reflecting on the profound changes in his life. Suddenly, he interrupted her flow of words. "Laurel, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice earnest. Laurel paused, her pen hovering mid-sentence, and looked up in anticipation. "I'm incredibly grateful to you for being on that bus that day," William began, his tone full of sincerity. "My life has changed so much since then. I've found true happiness and a loving partner in Sarah." He paused, his eyes glimmering with unshed tears. "And most importantly, I've experienced what it feels like to be a father and a grandfather." Laurel was taken aback by the depth of his emotion. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the noise of the cafe receding into the background. Seeing the misty eyes of a man who had once been guarded and distant moved her deeply. Without a word, she set down her pen and reached across the table to give William a heartfelt hug. It was a simple gesture, but it conveyed everything: pride, happiness, and a shared joy in the life William had embraced. They pulled back from the hug, smiles on their faces. "Thank you, Laurel, for everything," William said, his voice steady now, filled with gratitude. "And thank you, William, for becoming a part of our family," Laurel responded, her voice warm. "Seeing you so happy with Sarah and so loved by the kids, it's more than I could have hoped for." As they resumed their discussion about his schedule, there was a new lightness to their interaction, a mutual understanding and appreciation of the journey they had travelled together. From a chance encounter on a bus to a deep, familial bond, their lives had intertwined in unexpected, wonderful ways.